This is a CBC podcast.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. Christa Couture is a Cree and Scandinavian musician, broadcaster, mother, and now author. It's hard to grasp the breadth of loss that Christa has faced in her life, and those losses feature prominently in her new memoir.
It came up that I had lost a child. This was before I had lost a second, and the eyes of the woman I was talking to lit up. "I have a Prince of Skies," she said. She had lost a boy, her baby, late in pregnancy. It was a premature labor with complications. She described us as special, and I was taken aback. Special had never occurred to me. "We know something very few people know," she said. It's true. I have been witness to exceptional events. I never could have imagined the love I experienced when my first son was born, how my heart grew, how a part of my being that I never knew had hid within me was illuminated. Similarly, there was no way to predict the change his death in my arms would make, the privilege of holding him through his beginning in this world to his end. The loss of 2 children has deepened my compassion for others, expanded understanding, inspired a letting go of little things, and defined what matters most. Nothing could make my children's deaths seem worth it, but I can also feel gratitude for some of the changes. It's a duality that's hard to accept. I might argue that ignorance is bliss, and I would have been content to complain my days away on more trivial challenges. I didn't want this insight. But I can agree, we are a special few, and sometimes the separateness I have felt from other parents is rooted calmly in this knowing.
That's Christa Couture, reading from her new memoir, How to Lose Everything. Christa is my guest on the show today. Thanks so much for being here, Christa.
Thank you.
So, your book is called How to Lose Everything, and it talks about a range of losses you've dealt with in your life. What made you want to write this book now?
Well, I couldn't have written it any sooner, that's for sure. I needed enough time to pass. I needed all of these events to be in the past. Grief is such a falling into pieces, and writing a book is a literal piecing things together. So I kind of had to have it all in front of me so that I could figure out how I wanted to do that. And I mean, these stories I've been telling through my music for years, the stories that are in the book. But I think there was something that I was searching for that whole time, like in expressing myself, in wanting to be seen and heard and put these out there for people. That was very satisfying through music, but I felt like when I settled on writing the book, I got to go in depth in a way that I think I'd been looking for the whole time. And it felt like I finally told the stories in a way that I can now probably stop telling them. I mean, now the book is out and that story will be told every time someone reads it. But as far as an artist and creating from these experiences, I think the book finally became the most fulsome method for me to do that.
You've described your point form grief bio as cancer, death, divorce, more cancer. And I think the succinctness of that description kind of, it gives me pause a bit. It's a lot to unpack. But it almost feels intentional. Is it a way of just sort of putting everything out there on the table for you?
Yeah, it's just a little catchy grief bio. It's true, like in bullet form, it's a bit staggering. And I think even for myself in thinking about this book and what I wanted to write and sort of being like, well, there was this and this, I was like, wow, that's a lot. It's a lot. Each one of those is a lot. And so I distill it down to that to kind of give people a sense of what everything is to me in this book. And of course, the death, that's the deaths of 2 of my children. That's the biggest part of everything. And then there's all those other losses around it. But the grief bio just kind of became an easy way to try and explain it to people. And I think people like sometimes know 1 or 2 of those things about me. Like at a glance, they're like, oh, the person with 1 leg, or maybe they've, heard some other interview and they're like, oh, the person who lost 2 children, or the cancer survivor. Like there's kind of these different parts that people know. And my little grief bio is my way of saying, oh no, it's all one person.
It's all in there. It's all part of the story.
Yeah.
So you suffered loss at a fairly young age. You were 13 when you were diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma. Can you tell us a bit about that time in your life?
Yeah, I was 11 when I was first diagnosed, but 13 when my left leg was amputated above the knee. And so, which was the cure for my cancer. At 11, I started chemotherapy. I had radiotherapy. I went into remission. The cancer came back. I sometimes think about that time, just sort of like this exaggerated adolescence. It's a weird time for everybody. You're becoming aware of yourself in a new way, becoming very aware of your body. And so going through all those kind of adolescent changes was this sort of hyperbolic version by having cancer and having my hair fall out and being hospitalized and then losing my leg and learning to walk again. Felt like just a really over-the-top version of adolescence. I mean, it was really hard and it was really scary. And also, it's all that I know. I don't know what it's like to be a kid and not have cancer. And there was ways too, and I write about it in the book, but that being in the hospital and being with other sick kids, there was a kind of sense of belonging and there was a community there and there was friendships there. And even though, of course, I didn't want to be sick, there was also kind of joy in being in that place and being with them. So there was a few sides to it. But I think also being young, I didn't know how serious it was. Like now, we hear the word cancer and we all go, oh, well, we know what that means. And we all have been touched by it. Most people have, like, someone in their life, someone close to them has had cancer, has died from cancer. It's all around us. But as a kid, I didn't know that. I just knew that I was sick. I knew that some of my friends were dying in the hospital, but I kind of didn't really have a sense of how serious the C word is, which I think protected me a bit through it. Yeah,
I could see that. I loved that in the book, when you were told that your leg was going to be amputated, you said, bummer.
Yeah, bummer. 11, right? Yeah. I mean, I'd already at that point been in a hospital for 2 years. So it was kind of normalized because I'd met other kids who'd had lost limbs. And so I had a sense of it. But also, again, I didn't really know what I was losing. I didn't know what future I was losing. I'm sure my mother sitting at the table was thinking everything about my life that she thought I might have that she now knew I wouldn't. And I didn't know that. I think I'm sure losing a leg as an adult, like you kind of have your routine, you have, a career that maybe this, like your mobility is part of. And I wasn't losing all of those kind of things around me. But yeah, bummer. It was a bummer.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky thing to go through as a kid because other kids around you, they also have no filters. And I know you talk about the experience of going to school and sort of making the decision to either use that difference as, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was like you could either be fascinating or you could be outcast, right? Like you made a decision about how to treat that. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that was the beginning of me learning how to use my difference, as an edge, as an entry point, as, a way to make other people comfortable with it. And so there I was, at the beginning of chemotherapy, and my hair was starting to fall out, and I was using a wheelchair. I still had 2 legs, but the tumor in my leg made my bone too fragile, and so I had to use a wheelchair. And I would let people push me around. I'd let them use the chair. And when my hair started falling out, I let them pull my hair. It was kind of this magic trick that just a whole clump would come out. And I think there was a few things going on. I mean, in a way, yeah, taking ownership of this thing that kids could probably make fun of me for or could be cruel about, and trying to invite them in on the joke in a way before they made the joke. And I'm glad that I had that instinct. There also, I feel now some compassion and like a bit of sadness for that, of like, oh, like I had to do a lot of work to just try and kind of like get these people on side. And I think also just part of my own processing and trying to accept it and trying to be okay with the fact that these changes were happening really fast. And I was suddenly very different at a glance from everyone around me. When I was in school, like as in the hospital, I was the same, but in school, I was so different, overnight. And so, I would find ways to kind of try and beat them to the punch, I guess, and use it to my benefit, and in a way to protect myself and have some thick skin about it, but also in a way it's an act of ownership and my own way of trying to figure it out.
I think it's so interesting because I think children develop those coping skills, as we get older. But it seems like, having to develop those at such a rapid pace would be a difficult thing. So reading your book, it actually brought back a lot of memories for me because when I was quite young, I was 3, I had Kawasaki disease. And so I was in the hospital in the mid-'80s, so similar time frame. And I remember spending my 4th birthday in the hospital where I got a ton of My Little Ponies. I had the pony carriage. I had like a whole pony setup. I got like so many presents for my birthday that year. But, the memories have always been pretty hazy for me because I was so young. I just remember doing weird things like you would get a super high fever. And this was a time when Kawasaki disease was pretty rare in Canada. So they didn't really know what it was for a while. But yeah, like my skin peeled off, like sunburn peeled off.
Oh, God.
And I just remember hiding it under my pillow because I thought I was going to get in trouble.
Oh.
But I know it's so sad.
Yeah.
But also just like that, when you talk about community in the book, like the community you had with other kids, that sort of came back to me. Like I remember doing egg spoon races, like with all these other sick kids.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm wondering, for you, what were some of the things? I had my ponies. What did you have to help you as a young person getting through that time?
A lot of Nintendo games. That became sort of the thing that I would like bat my hairless eyes at my parents and say, please. So I first got diagnosed in 1989. And so, in the hospital, you had to book the TV with the VCR and you could only get it like for 2 hours once a week. And they'd wheel this cart into your room. And but at home, because I was often not really well enough to be kind of out and about and doing a lot, like in between chemotherapy treatments, it was Nintendo games. And that was probably the thing that my parents gave into buying me.
That was a pretty good era of Nintendo games.
Oh, it really was. I mean, it was just like Super Nintendo is just kind of starting. This is Super Mario Brothers 2 and 3. I mean, that's as good as it gets.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. Christa Couture is my guest on the show today, and we're talking about life, love, loss, and getting through it all. So, loss is obviously a major part of the memoir, How to Lose Everything. But that theme also pops up in your songwriting as well. Is it a processing tool for you?
Absolutely. I think if I were a gardener, I probably would have just been digging in dirt for the last 10 years. But music primarily has been my thing. It's been my way of expressing myself, my way of trying to understand my experiences. Songs have felt like my teachers at times. A song will come to me. I mean, songs at their best, I don't feel like I write them. I feel like I just start to sing them like I've just suddenly remembered something. And those songs have always been gifts. And I learned so much about myself through them. And there's ways that playing music has been, cathartic, like playing piano and getting to bang and hit something and sing and cry out. I mean, that feels good. And like, that's the stuff that no one will ever see or hear. Like, I have written songs no one needs to hear because they're just too cathartic. They're not something I could craft into something. But yeah, it's been a major outlet in so many ways. Performing has been very fulfilling and is an outlet. And it's been a means to connect with people and for people to share their stories with me. It's always been... I don't know, even my go-to. I don't know what to call it. It's just there. Writing is just there. It just happens.
Yeah, I know you mentioned in the book there was a specific song lyrics that came to you in a Value Village parking lot.
Yeah, you can't, the muse, she just shows up. She does no manners, that one.
And so in your book, you talk about how music was influential in your young life. And as we've just heard from the Beaches soundtrack, can you tell me a bit about some of your earliest musical memories?
My earliest musical memories. are with my family. My mother has a beautiful voice. She's a singer. She was in a folk trio in the 60s called the Cellar Dwellers. They sang a lot of Peter, Paul, and Mary covers, which are in of themselves covers. And my father, I grew up participating in ceremony with him and so all of the traditional music that was there, and just his deep, resounding voice. That in the sweat lodge, he was singing ceremony music, but in the car, it was the Stetler brothers, and he loved to hit the low bass notes of country music. And so it was just always around me. And my sister as well is a singer and has a beautiful voice and plays violin. And so there just always was music. I can't remember my life without it.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. Christa Couture is my guest on the show today. Her memoir, How to Lose Everything, is in stores now. So I can imagine that writing a memoir is a pretty daunting task. And with a story as large as yours, with so many stories to tell, how did you decide which stories to focus on?
Originally, when I thought about writing a book, some book, it was going to be just about my son, Ford. I talked about how I've been telling these stories in music and talking a lot about my sons through music. And I wanted to tell more of his story. That was my idea. And then I was talking with my agent, and there was a blog that I kept during my son Ford's life. He lived for 14 months and had all kinds of medicalized challenges, and it was a complex and extraordinary 14 months. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go through the blogs. I'm going to write a book about this. And she was like, do you think that might be too much for you as a writer, or too much for a reader? It wouldn't have to be, but it would have to be. I'd have to be very careful with writing that book in a way that wouldn't just overwhelm people or potentially overwhelm myself. And she's absolutely right. It would have overwhelmed me. And then I thought, I kind of zoomed out from that and was like, well, maybe it's just being a mother of a lost mom, as we sometimes say, maybe it's just about my two sons. And she kind of sat back and she's like, well, you also you only have one leg. That's pretty interesting. I was like, really? Is it? Does anyone want to hear about that? I don't know. And then we just kind of in conversation, I started to think of, this is probably that conversation is where my grief bio came to be, because it was like, oh, right, the cancer and leg and then divorce after my sons died and then having thyroid cancer after that. And it was like, oh, right, there's all these other things. And when I started to link them through this idea or theme of loss, I got excited about piecing the stories together in that way. It gave me, a framework, as they say. It gave me something to work with. And I liked that idea. I also liked that it meant I could kind of drop into these different stories and tell a bit of them and weave them together and connect them, but not in a way that was going to primarily overwhelm me as a writer, but really think deliberately about writing something that was going to be vulnerable and be intimate, but not kind of dump this stuff on people. And so in connecting all these different stories, instead of zooming in and writing a whole book about just Ford, it was a way to kind of tell pieces of it without it being too much, hopefully without it being too much.
So, as you describe in the book, you lost two children, Emmett as a newborn, Ford when he was 14 months old. And you've described losing your children as more than just losses, but as dismantlings. And I thought that word really struck me. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, for me, those losses, after my first son, Emmett, died, I felt like I was flattened. But then after Ford died, I felt like I was almost in this negative space, just was nothing, felt like nothing was left. I was, dismantled. I was destroyed. And in rebuilding, it's not putting the same thing back together. It was trying to find something new. And so it took years, those losses for me, maybe, calling them dismantlings is also because it was they were such huge events, and it was such a huge task to continue. You know, I think there's types of grief, or I've experienced types of grief that, you know, take the wind out of you, but you can kind of still recognize yourself. And I felt like with those losses, I didn't know what was left, and I didn't know what I could imagine in the future.
You went back to when you were a kid in the hospital in your book, and you wrote about hearing parents lose their children. Then you found yourself a part of that club, one that no one wants to join. How much of that came back to you when you found yourself in that situation?
You know, surprisingly, I don't know if it was until I wrote the book. Like, I hadn't really made sense of that. I mean, in the book, I talk about remembering other parents' grief as a kid. And I remember kind of pondering what their life must be like. You know, once a certain kid isn't at the hospital anymore after they've died, it's sort of like, well, where is their family? What are they doing? What happens? What does that even look like? And I remember kind of being aware of that absence each time. But it wasn't until writing the book, and I think that's one of the gifts the book gave me, was that it gave me that sort of circular perspective, and that I held those parents in my heart in a new way, and just kind of remembered their grief and recognized their grief. And, you know, it's maybe strange. I felt a bit like I felt less alone in a sense when I thought of them. I thought, oh, right, I've seen this. And look at all the time that's passed for them. Of course, they're still hurting. Of course, they're still grieving. It's been 30 years. And, but I kind of imagining them helped me have a sense of time passing. And I think I didn't really, piece those things together until I wrote it down in the book and went, oh, yeah, that I saw that. And now I'm also one of them.
The loss of one child, let alone two, will bring great changes in your life, as well as, you know, the divorce and cancer and all of these things. So what have you done to help overcome some of these deep losses?
You know, for a while there, it was making music. Music gave me, you know, as I described, like it was an outlet, and but it was also just like a to-do list. There was something very practical about that being my job for a while. And because it's also, you know, when you have a big creative project, it's months. You're thinking, okay, 8 months from now, I have to be in this theater doing this thing. There's a lot of forward planning. It's not just next week. And that really gave me things to hold on to, and obligations and commitments that would get me out of bed. And, you know, time passing. I think people ask me for advice, and I try not to give it. And the last section of the book is more like my observations, which you can, or, you know, choose or not to take as advice. But in it, that's my greatest piece, is like, you have to wait. You have to let time pass, and you have to let those pieces settle. And if it is a dismantling, if it is something that has wiped you out, there's no quick exit. And, it's such a slow process. And I think it just, you know, it took years for me to feel like I had overcome or pushed through or, you know, gotten used to some of these things. As we all know, and we know in our community so deeply, when you have experienced deep, true, devastating loss, it takes your future from you. It's impossible to hope. It takes hope from you. And for me, deciding to try and have a child was a way of claiming a future. It was a way of dreaming something and saying, okay, I can now imagine something ahead of me. It might not be what happens. It might not work out, but I'm ready to at least hope for something. And so what helped me get there, I mean, I'm saying time and art, also therapy. I've been extremely lucky and privileged to have the resources and to have access to therapists, and I have had people around me who have taken care of me. It's never been just me that's gotten me through, because I've just been extremely lucky and privileged to have help and resources and food and all of those things.
I've also read that Buffy the Vampire Slayer may have had something, may have had a hand in helping out.
Oh, yeah. Oh, man. Lying on my couch and watching just seasons and seasons of things all day long for weeks, that also helped me get through. I mean, when I talk about time passing, that's a great way. to just pass the time until you can fall asleep again when you are in shock, when you are in your early days of grieving. So yeah, I watched Buffy. I watched Lost because I had like missed it the first time. And then I watched Angel because I just finished Buffy, you know, so I went through those. And I'd missed the last 2 seasons.
Right.
And, you know.
Yep. I know that you also, you played Nintendo as a child, but you also played World of Warcraft. Is this correct?
Yeah, for 1 year and 1 year only. This was another like coping mechanism. Shortly after my son Ford, my second son, died. Actually, it was while he was in the hospital. It became something I would do. I'd get home. My partner and I would like take turns being in the hospital. And for a while we were here in Toronto. We lived in Vancouver, but we had been transferred to Sick Kids Hospital. And so we were living at the Ronald McDonald House. And we were in the Toronto Maple Leafs themed room. It was not a cozy spot. Sorry, Ronald McDonald House. I think they've since changed.
Were you like more of a Habs fan or?
I was like, get back to this room. Just like murals of hockey players on the wall. So it was like not a cozy, restful place. And I would like get back there and be eating my takeout. And I'd, just have like sort of 2 hours to try, like just not even reset, but just try and be okay for a second before I'd go back to the hospital. And that's when I started playing World of Warcraft. I had a blood elf mage named Vanna Wheat. And I just it was another way. I mean, you can get into gaming, like hours go by. It's another really good one to pass the time. And the thing that was nice about online gaming is that, like literally operating through this avatar and having conversations with people who knew nothing about me, we're just talking about the game or whatever daily stuff. And it was a way that I could kind of have interactions with people and not have to say, my son is dying, or not have them look at me and go, oh God, your son is dying. It was a great escape. And then kind of after a year, there was just one day where I just didn't turn it back on. I had served its purpose. Thanks. Wow.
So when I was reading the book, there was something that really stood out to me, and it was you've mentioned it briefly, which is the field guide section, the field guide on grief, in which you sort of give ways to move forward.
Yeah, the field guide is almost an epilogue. I mean, it's the last passage of the last chapter, but it's in the second person, and it's no longer about me. I mean, it's not an anecdote anymore. It's not sort of a scene from my life. And once I had that section, or the idea for that section, it was one of the first things that I wrote, because it gave me something to work towards, and it gave me a sense of knowing where I was going to end the stories. I knew kind of chronologically that I was going to end it, in getting pregnant and deciding to have my daughter. I knew that, but I wasn't totally sure what I wanted to leave people with, like you say. And so that chapter, it starts with sort of 2 descriptions of where I am with grief now and how it's present in my life. And then the field guide was trying to satisfy the people who do ask me for advice in a way. Because I think people are like, so what is the nugget of wisdom? I don't have it. But here's, the first line of that is, this is what I know. So it's like, this is what I've seen. This is what I've learned. I know that these are extraordinary experiences. I know that I have been to some places that not many people have been. But the field guide was it was like a more creative way of writing about those experiences.
Yeah, I quite loved that. I think it was such a perfect way of ending.
Thank you. I think, too, I didn't want there to be a sort of Hollywood, and now everything's fine, the end. It was like, it just kind of shifted the tone a little and kept us in that, sort of circular. It's like,
yes.
And these things will keep happening, and they'll be happening to other people, and they might happen to you. And that's what I wanted to leave people with.
I can see it being a portion of the book that I will return to, because I feel like at some point, these words are words that we all, I think we will all need, whether we like it or not. One thing that struck me is the depth of memory that you have of all of these experiences, right? There's so much detail in the book, and when people deal with trauma, I know that your memory isn't always functioning at its most optimal. When you're writing parts of the memoir, you have to sit in the emotion and you have to be able to write it. How did you revisit some of these experiences while maintaining, good mental and emotional health for yourself?
Yeah. Because I was writing this, after all the therapy, after the years have passed, after tears and tears and tears, I did have a sense of when to stop and how to take care of myself. And I think, I couldn't have written it, or I wouldn't have made it through if I didn't have those tools to pause and tend. But absolutely, there were times where I would just have to stop writing and look up and look around. But also those moments, I was grateful for those moments, and I tried to welcome them, because it was a chance for me to grieve a little more, or, in particular with the chapters about my sons. That grief, that well is never going to dry up. And so I would, I would start to cry, and I would think, okay, it's here again. But the book helped me kind of go, okay, then I'm just going to cry. I'm just going to pause and let this happen, and I'm not going to fight it. And it's nice. Like, I think there's something also when you're grieving, at a certain stage of grieving, like that, it's a remembering, and it's a way of being with those memories. And so sometimes, even though it could hurt, it was like, oh, like I get to just be with that. And if it's too much, then I know how to get myself out of it now.
Normally, with the release of a book, you'd be out in bookstores, doing readings and meeting people. I'm sure a lot of what you've written about loss and about grief really resonates with lots of people, obviously myself included here today. And I know that they reach out and they try to connect with you. What are you hearing from people who have read the book?
Yeah, I really wish, of course, for all the reasons I wish the pandemic was not happening, but in part because then I wish I could be releasing my book in person. That is not the biggest part, but because I love that part. I love the someone coming up to you and, saying, can I give you a hug, or can I tell you my story? And you can see them bursting. And I love receiving that. I love hearing that. I put these things out there not just to say, this is me. I want to hear back. I want to know those stories from other people. And so they have been coming, on Instagram and in Facebook Messenger, and all the ways that people have been sending letters, and people are sharing their stories. And, the person that they lost, or what it reminded them of, or 30 years ago, this happened. And it's exciting. This is my first book. I haven't done this before. So there's ways about the kind of putting something out in the world that is familiar to me. I put out 7 albums. I kind of know the cycle. But there's something about, that I'm hearing from people who've sat and held this book for hours in their hands, and then are sharing their words with me. It's really powerful. It's really meaningful.
Yeah, and I know you've done that through, when you play music and shows, people will often come up to you who know your story, and in some ways take it upon yourself to hold those stories or hold those names in your heart and in your mind, and you often dedicate songs to people when you play. Is there a cost to having to hold those stories?
Not yet. No, I think because it's reciprocal, because people are holding my stories, and there's an exchange. So there's a trade, it's like I'm receiving and I'm holding, but I'm getting to let go of something and give it to someone else. I say in the field guide in the end, the kind of the act of honoring, but also forgetting. And I think that there's a way when we share stories, not necessarily to forget them, but we're sort of sharing pieces of them so that we don't have to all carry the loads ourselves. So it feels more like an exchange. I feel like, I'm not just this kind of lightning rod and all this stuff is coming to me. It's like there's something continual happening.
Right.
And so, no, it's never felt like too much.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. Christa Couture is my guest on the show today. So we've talked a lot about loss and about grief and getting through it on the show today, but I want to talk about something else. Can you tell me a bit about your daughter?
Her name is Sona. I dedicate the book to her as being the other side of everything, because she was a turning point for me, and she is such a joy. She's 3, and so she's just energetic and funny and curious, and revealing herself to me day by day. And I feel so lucky and so excited and grateful and blessed that she's in my life. It's such a joy. It's so challenging. It's so fun. It's everything. And, of course, I've been a mom for 14 years now. And it was just my son Emmett's birthday 2 weeks ago. He would be 14. And that was always going to be the case. I was always going to be a mom. But Sona is such a different experience. It's being a mom in a new way with her that I really, really love.
So I think there are so many points of entry into your book, something that can speak to just about anyone at, any time. And I confess, I literally hugged your book when I finished it.
That's the best.
Because I could feel how impactful it will be for people and how impactful it was for me to read. And, what do you want people to take away from your first book?
If hugging is within their comfort zone, I want everyone to hug the book. Absolutely. I want two things for the book. I want people to either see themselves in it and see their heartbreak. I feel like what I did with this book is I'm sort of like I'm holding my hands out. I'm like, here's some of my really hard stories. You can look at them. You don't have to touch them. Don't worry. And I'm going to hold them up for you to see. But they're mine. And I feel like what I kind of hope is that there's an invitation that someone might hold up their own for themselves, or, by hugging the book, by being present with their own, sad story and the beauty of it. I don't mean sad story like sob story, kind of pity. I mean the complexity and beauty of sadness and the gifts that sorrow can bring us. And I hope that if people see themselves in my book, then that's what I hope for. I also hope if they don't, if it doesn't resonate with them, like personally, I hope that it's then at least maybe an insight into what some of these experiences are like for people around them. If they meet someone who's lost a child, or they meet someone who's lost a parent, like is touched by grief in the very present moment, or cancer, or, that they will think about that person a little differently.
Yeah, I think, I have some people in my life that I'm definitely going to hand it to. So thanks so much for being here today. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
Christa Couture is an author, musician, and broadcaster. Her latest EP is called Safe Harbor, and her new memoir, How to Lose Everything, is out now. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. If you want to get in touch with us, send an email to unreserved@cbc.ca, or you can find us on Facebook or Twitter. This episode was produced by Stephanie Cram, Kyle Musica, and Anna Lazowski. I'm Phelan Johnson. Nyawagoa for listening.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.